Welcome to Reminiscing with History Makers. We're here with Bob Marz, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So we'll start with, when did you join APCO?
In 1966, a few years ago.
Yeah. Would you describe your agency and position?
I started out as a radio engineer with the Utah Highway Patrol. Technically remained in the same job for 35 years, although for the first 25 we were actually sworn officers and part of the Highway Patrol, and then they switched and made a Department of Communications where I worked with them for 5 years, and then they moved us over to the information technologies and was there for the remainder of the service. So, but it was basically 35 years with the state of Utah, but always doing the same job. Just different titles, different bosses.
Sure. Could you give a brief list of your responsibilities?
Yes, I actually installed and maintained all the radio equipment for the state of Utah north of Salt Lake City. And that was for all state agencies, and we did also some service work for county sheriffs and some city police departments that didn't have technicians.
Could you describe what course drew you to APCO, and if there was a particular person influential in getting you to join?
No, the starting of APCO was sort of interesting in that I actually knew nothing about APCO. And there was, back at that time, there was an Intermountain chapter of APCO, which included Utah and southern Idaho. And I guess it had gone inactive for some time. And so they were going to reactivate that. And since I worked northern Utah and bordered Idaho, my boss asked me and one other fellow to go up to the meeting in Burley, Idaho, and see what it was all about, you know, and become members of it. And sort of that's how we wound up, and both of us wound up with positions since we represented Utah. One was on the, I actually was part of the chapter executive committee, and the other fellow was put in as frequency coordinator, but then he quit just a few months later, and I wound up with frequency coordination, and I've been doing it ever since, still doing it.
Can you describe your APCO activities at the state chapter and national level during your tenure at APCO?
Well, mainly the biggest thing I've been involved with has been the frequency coordination. When I started in Utah, there had not been a coordinator there before, so I wound up going one day over to Denver to the FCC office and spent the day there copying down all the licensees in Utah, so I had some idea who was using what. And then I was pretty much did that. And in 1972, Utah decided to become a chapter of its own. And at that time, I was put in as the Secretary-Treasurer to get that thing started. One of the charter members of the Utah chapter. And I held positions at the executive committee of the chapter for on and off. I declined going in as president for one main reason. They asked me a couple of times, but as frequency coordinator, you get people that sometimes are upset with you because you can't give them what they want. So everything should be just handed to them. And so I decided that if my name was in as president as well as the frequency coordinator, a lot of people probably wouldn't join, so I sort of declined that. But then in 1980, I was put in as the chapter's national executive member, and was on the national executive board for 14 years. And then my first actual national assignment, I guess, came in, it was 1985. Anyway, Chuck English asked me to be the chairman of the law enforcement committee, and then also asked me to be on a task force when we were going to pick out a supplier for database for frequency coordination, a vendor. And so I served on that committee, but I guess some of the more interesting things was in '89, APCO decided that they wanted to, rather than paying $35,000 a month to a vendor, develop their own AFC database and system. And so I was asked to chair the, what they call the Needs Analysis Committee. It was made up of 4 region local advisors or frequency coordinators who were still called in before they changed the names. And we met and got information from our regions and compiled that information into what we wanted as a, as a computer system to do frequency coordination. And then that was completed, and I was asked to join the group to actually start building the system, and was involved with that for for a number of years actually, and was one of the main beta testers up until they decided to go out for an outside vendor again. Also in 1981, I was put on the AFC Board of Directors, which is now the ADCOM. And everything I go on, they change the names. But and I was on that for 14 years as well. And that was probably one of the more interesting and highlights of my APCO part. But after that, I've sort of got laid back a little bit more. I still do the frequency coordination for Utah, and still enjoy doing that. But that's about been my deal with APCO. I'm still, a member of the Utah chapter. Actually, a historian for them now, because I guess I'm the old guy. Got all the history.
Well, that's why we're here, right? Would you say your APCO membership has had a direct effect on your career in public safety communications?
Well, I think it has in a way. I got to learn an awful lot, about the regulations and things that are required by the FCC, and and I learned that, through being involved with APCO and with AFC, with frequency coordination, and that I was more aware of, what can and cannot be done out in the field when it comes to the telecommunications, and sort of my job, I think, to keep our other engineers around the state in line somewhat on that. I have to maybe say one humorous thing that happened was that we had a site at Ball Mesa down in Grand County. And Grand County had put in a new radio system, was using our location, our tower. And the application had come through, and I'm not necessarily familiar with what all the other engineers are doing, and it said the antenna was mounted at the 60-foot level on the tower. Well, I get a call from the FCC as a coordinator saying the towers, the state of Utah tower says it's 60-foot. This is mounted at the 60-foot level, and you only got a 40-foot tower. How are you doing that? Told me we use sky hooks. And anyway, it turned out I had to get a hold of the engineer. Well, you didn't. We wound up putting a smaller 105-foot tower up there. You probably don't know about the 105-foot one we put here and there. So, because I had to do the licensing. And they were supposed to let me know about these things so I could keep them up to date, but the FCC was pretty good about that. Got to work pretty well with those guys.
What would you say you like most about APCO?
I just think the camaraderie that I've been able to make over the years, and also not only with APCO itself. I was the exhibit chairman for the 2 national conferences held in Salt Lake, and got to know a lot of the vendors and that, and had a good relationship with a lot of the vendors as well. But I think just the association with other people. Wish there were more technicians around still, though.
What would you say APCO does better than anyone else?
Well, there again, I guess that's the one. I think that the one thing that they seem to do, seem to have more influence and have more respect in that from the Federal Communications Commission. That they, I think they represent the needs of public safety better than any other public safety organization, especially when it comes to the requirements for communications and public safety.
What stands out to you as a significant contribution during your time in office?
I think probably the development of the computerized frequency coordination systems that we were involved with there for that 3-4 year period. We're getting them first developed, and then we'd meet every at conferences and during the year, during our AdCom meetings and whatnot, and take information and upgrades, and we debate over what ought to be done and how much it would cost to get done and things of that nature. And then as they developed, the initial system was a DOS system, and as a development into the Windows-based system and that, and then as everything has progressed until they went out to a private vendor again. I'm pretty heavily involved in that, and also there was a time too that a couple of times where we were having a sort of a situation down here when they're going to change over, they hired a fellow, and then we did the RFPs. And then they decided he wasn't doing the thing. Well, before that, they asked me to come down when I retired and work with them to let them know what we wanted in this system that he was going to be building. And he had some good stuff, but he just never got the thing tied together. And finally, the AdCom, about a little over a year later, just decided to give the people a way out and tell them that if he hasn't got it done by such and such a date, let's go just put it out for bid like we were going to begin with rather than hiring someone. But it was the development of that system, I think, and my involvement in that was probably my biggest achievement with APCO. And it was nice coming down and down to Florida for a couple of weeks and work with them, and that was about it. I've enjoyed being with APCO, and I guess if you're going to stick around for 50 years, you better enjoy it.
Great. Well, thank you for all your involvement, and thanks for being on Reminiscing with History Makers.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for having me.